My name is Robert Vance. I am 52 years old and I live in Seattle. For 7 long years, I poured my entire soul into Apex Implant Technologies, a medical device company that manufactures surgical implants and specialized operating room supplies. If you had asked me back then what defined me, I would have told you it was my work. After my painful divorce, when the house felt far too quiet and the nights stretched on forever, I made a conscious choice. I decided that if my personal life was in pieces, my professional life would be a monument of reliability. I threw myself into the operations department, believing that absolute dedication would shield me from the cold realities of the world. I worked long weekends, skipped vacations, and made sure every single shipment was completely flawless. I believed that, by building an unbreakable professional reputation, I could somehow make up for the failures in my personal relationships. I started at the company as a logistics coordinator, managing shipments and warehouse inventory for major hospitals across the Pacific Northwest. Those early months were grueling. I remember one specific week when a massive snowstorm threatened to shut down our primary distribution hub. I stayed at the office for 3 consecutive nights, sleeping on a couch in the break room, just to make sure the operating rooms in Portland and Spokane received their implants on time. When the crisis passed, my supervisor, Douglas Croft, walked into my office. He handed me a hot cup of coffee, looked me straight in the eyes, and told me that I was the kind of man a company could build a future around. He said that if I kept up that level of dedication, I would go as far as I wanted. From that moment, I believed him. Douglas was a natural mentor, and I let his words guide my career. Over the next 7 years, I climbed the ranks to become the senior manager of operations. I restructured our entire supply chain, trained every new supervisor, and cut delivery delays by nearly 40%. My projects always hit their targets. I genuinely believed that Apex was the place where I would finish my career. Douglas often joked that I was the iron backbone of the operations division, the only person he could call at 4 in the morning when the shipping line failed. I laughed and felt proud of that status, entirely blind to how hollow those compliments would eventually sound. My dedication came at a high cost. My son, Tyler, who is now 18, was growing up fast. He lived in Portland and stayed with me 2 weekends a month. Every time he visited, I promised to close my laptop, but the phone always rang. Tyler would look at me with calm, knowing eyes. He told me he hoped I was building a life, not just a career. I nodded, telling him I was doing it for his future. But deep down, I was using the office as a shield to avoid my loneliness. 7 years passed, and our regional director, Franklin, retired. Douglas hinted for months that the position was mine. It was not just vague encouragement. My record was unmatched. I had the top performance metrics 3 years straight and the trust of every major hospital partner. Douglas told me to be patient, and that when Franklin left, the seat was mine. In the first week of April, HR announced a restructure meeting. My heart hammered. I spent the night drafting a speech about teamwork, loyalty, and our shared growth. I pictured Douglas shaking my hand while my coworkers stood to applaud. The next morning, I wore my best charcoal suit. I arrived an hour early, brewed coffee, and arranged my notes. The conference room was packed. My operations colleague, Sarah Jennings, whispered that her bet was on me. I smiled, trying to stay calm. At 10 sharp, the meeting began. Douglas stood on stage talking about innovation and growth. Then he paused, saying the company needed fresh faces and leadership. His eyes swept the room, passing over me. He introduced our new director of operations, Zachary Thorne. The room went dead silent, followed by polite, scattered applause. I looked at Sarah, who was as stunned as I was. A young man in an expensive suit walked up to shake Douglas's hand. Zachary was a recent hire from strategic planning, someone I had only seen in passing. He smiled with the confidence of someone who had never worked a weekend in his life. Douglas wrapped up the meeting, announcing that I would personally assist Zachary during the transition. He said nobody knew the systems better than I did. I heard my own voice, quiet and mechanical, agreeing to help. But inside I felt a bone-deep emptiness. The loyalty I had given this company meant nothing. I had spent 7 years building a ladder, only for Douglas to hand it to a stranger. When the meeting ended, people crowded around Zachary. I shook his hand and said the words expected of me. He thanked me with a smile so earnest it made me sick. I stayed behind in the empty room, looking at the silver company slogan on the wall, "Leadership through loyalty." I let out a dry, bitter laugh. I had finally realized how long I had been believing the wrong people. I was just a tool to them, completely replaceable. 3 days after the meeting that turned my professional world upside down, I officially began training Zachary. He showed up on time, laptop in hand, looking polished and clean-cut, like he was preparing for a television interview, rather than stepping into an intricate operations network he barely understood. He smiled brightly and suggested we start with the Northwest Distribution dashboard. I nodded, opening the operations portal on the main screen. I told him that before he could think about managing the dashboard, he needed to understand the logic behind the layout. I spent the morning walking him through the backup warehouse system, the emergency delivery routes, and the typical failure points for each of our primary suppliers. Zachary typed notes rapidly, nodding at every sentence, but I could tell he was only capturing the words, not the operational reality. He was bright, but he was completely raw. Worst of all, he lacked the self-awareness to stop talking and start listening. I decided to test his instincts. I asked him what he would do if the Spokane warehouse experienced a localized shutdown due to winter weather. He answered quickly, suggesting we immediately reroute shipments from our Seattle facility. I pressed him, asking what he would do if the Seattle facility was already running at minimum capacity. He paused, frowning at his keyboard, and suggested finding a third-party vendor on the spot. I shook my head and explained that his first step should always be contacting the 3 regional hospitals to assess their actual inventory urgency, and then utilizing our Portland Reserve system, which could back us up within 18 hours. Zachary stared at me, his confidence wavering slightly, and asked how I remembered all of these hidden connections. I told him that I did not need to remember them, because I had spent 7 years designing the system so it would think for me. We worked until noon, at which point Zachary left for a lunch meeting with Douglas. I returned to my desk, feeling a heavy fatigue settle in. My inbox chimed with a message from Sarah, asking to speak with me privately. I walked down the hall to her office and she locked the door behind me. Her face was tense as she told me that Zachary had just been added to the strategic decision group. I frowned. Knowing that Douglas personally led that select committee, which met every Thursday morning, I had spent years requesting to join that group, only to be told that we needed to keep the circle tight to avoid unnecessary noise. Yet a kid with 6 months of planning experience was welcomed with open arms. A cold realization washed over me. This was not just about Zachary getting a promotion. It was about Douglas systematically rebuilding the inner circle of the company, and I was being quietly pushed to the periphery. Sarah leaned closer and revealed the real connection. She explained that Zachary was the eldest son of Nicholas Thorne, the owner of Thorne Biotech. The company was our primary supplier of specialized surgical materials, and our contracts with them were worth millions of dollars annually. I sat in silence as the pieces clicked together. I knew how profitable those supply agreements were, but I had never imagined Douglas would compromise the integrity of our operations for a personal alliance. Sarah sighed and pointed out that Zachary had only been with us for 5 months, yet he was already positioned to oversee the very operations that bought his family's products. That afternoon, I drove to our main Seattle warehouse to perform a physical inventory audit. I needed to clear my head. While there, I met with Elena Rostov, the warehouse manager. She handed me the latest inbound manifest, then glanced around to make sure we were alone. She whispered that rumors were circulating about a plan to transition our entire inventory tracking network to Thorntech software, a system owned by Zachary's father. I froze, knowing that the Thorntech system was notoriously unstable and had never been tested on a logistics network of our scale. If the rumor was true, Zachary's promotion was just the first phase of a larger corporate takeover. When I got home that evening, I sat in the dark living room, listening to the steady rain tapping against the glass. I thought about the early days when Douglas would introduce me at conferences as the engine that kept the company running. I had taken so much pride in that title, but now I saw it for what it was. To Douglas, I was never a partner or a successor. I was just a reliable machine to be used until a more profitable arrangement came along. A message popped up on my phone from Tyler, asking if I was doing okay. I stared at the screen, feeling a lump in my throat, and typed that I was managing. He replied instantly, telling me that I was the strongest man he knew, but that I did not have to carry everything alone. I gripped the phone, feeling a shift in my perspective. The corporate ladder I had climbed for 7 years was built on hollow promises. The next morning, I arrived at the office before sunrise. I opened the digital archives and searched for communication between Douglas and the Thorn Group. I uncovered a series of private emails detailing strategic integration plans and soft launch dates for their software migration. I copied the files onto a secure drive, not because I wanted to destroy the company, but because I needed proof of how my years of loyalty were being traded for family favors. I spent the next morning analyzing the files I had recovered from the server. Every contract revision and email thread between Douglas and the Thorn representatives revealed a troubling pattern. The technical specifications for our incoming surgical materials had been subtly altered. Testing standards, tensile strength requirements, and chemical purity metrics had all been dialed back to accommodate cheaper production. I had managed material validation early in my career, and I knew how dangerous these minor modifications could be. A slight change in bioreactivity or metallic composition could lead to implant rejection, bone inflammation, or structural failure inside a patient's body. The medical implications were terrifying, yet they were being ignored for profit. I immediately called Elena at the Seattle warehouse and asked her to perform an independent chemical and physical analysis on the latest batch of orthopedic titanium plates we had received from Thorn Biotech. 3 hours later, my phone rang. Elena's voice was shaking as she told me I needed to see the results in person. I drove to the warehouse immediately, navigating the wet highway in a daze. Elena met me in a rear testing bay, where she had opened one of the large shipping crates. She pulled out a sheet of the alloy, and even without specialized equipment, I could see the problem. The surface was rough, lacking the smooth, mirror-like finish required for sterile surgical applications. Elena showed me the spectrometer readings and the tensile strength charts on her monitor, explaining that the residual oxide levels were 3 times the federal safety limit. If these plates were implanted into patients, the metallic degradation would cause massive inflammation and tissue damage. I looked at the data, feeling a cold dread pool in my stomach. I thanked Elena, instructed her to keep the report confidential, and told her to secure the samples in a locked cabinet. I waited until the end of the day to confront Douglas. I found him in his private office, reviewing financial spreadsheets on a large monitor. When I walked in, he signaled for me to wait, finished typing, and then looked up with a calm smile. I did not waste time. I laid the testing reports on his desk and explained that the new Thorn Biotech shipment failed our safety standards. I told him the oxide levels were triple the limit and could cause severe harm to patients. Douglas scanned the papers, his smile fading into a patronizing expression. He leaned back in his leather chair, crossed his arms, and told me that I was letting my personal frustrations cloud my judgment. He said that in the manufacturing business, minor deviations were normal and that we were not performing surgery ourselves. I countered, stating that we supplied the surgeons, and I could not sign off on a shipment that violated federal regulations and endangered lives. Douglas's tone turned ice cold. He told me that I did not understand the complexities of corporate relationships. He explained that Thorn Biotech was our most critical strategic partner and that our future growth depended on their cooperation. He suggested that sometimes, silence was the most professional choice a manager could make. I told him that silence in the face of dangerous product defects was not professional, it was criminal. Douglas stood up, leaning over his desk, and warned me that I was crossing a line. He said that if I lacked the stomach to handle operations at this level, he could easily find someone else to sign the release forms. I told him to go ahead and assign it elsewhere, because my name would never be attached to a compromised product. I walked out of his office, my chest burning with anger. I spent the evening at my home computer, organizing my evidence. I compiled the original design specifications, The modified contract agreements, Elena's chemical analysis reports, and photographs of the defective titanium plates. I saved everything onto a secure external drive and sent an encrypted copy to my private email. I knew I was taking a massive risk, but I refused to let 7 years of hard work turn me into a quiet accomplice to corporate greed. The next morning, I arrived to find a white envelope sitting on my keyboard. It was a formal notification from HR requesting my presence at a mandatory mid-cycle performance review at 3 o'clock that afternoon. When I walked into the HR conference room, I was met by the department director and an attorney from our legal team. They spoke in soft, measured corporate tones. They claimed that several employees had reported feeling intimidated by my recent interactions, and that I was creating unnecessary friction within the operations department. They suggested that my communication style was not aligned with the company's collaborative culture. I listened to their rehearsed speech, realizing that Douglas had already set his trap to silence me. I told them that I welcomed a positive work environment, but I would not be pressured into overlooking safety violations to keep the peace. The room fell silent. When I left the office that evening, Douglas was standing near the elevators. He did not say a word, but his cold, calculating gaze told me everything I needed to know. The battle had officially begun. I spent the weekend weighing my options. The threat of losing my career was real, but the threat to human lives was far greater. On Monday morning, I walked into the office and noticed Zachary staring at his computer screen with a look of pure panic. When I passed his desk, he called out my name in a quiet, trembling voice, asking if I had a minute. I stepped into his office and he quickly closed the door. He turned his screen toward me and showed me an urgent email from Legacy Health Center in Portland. They had detected severe corrosion on several orthopedic plates during pre-surgical sterilization. Zachary whispered that Douglas had instructed him to ignore the message and label it as minor feedback. He asked me if this was normal, his eyes wide with fear. I looked at the young man and realized he was not the architect of this scheme. He was the decoy. I decided to explain the legal reality. I told him that Douglas was setting him up. I explained the legal doctrine of breach of fiduciary duty, specifically the duty of loyalty and the duty of care. I explained that as the director of operations, he was a corporate officer. Under corporate law, officers owe a fiduciary duty to act in the best interests of the corporation and its stakeholders. The duty of loyalty strictly prohibits self-dealing and conflicts of interest. By signing off on defective shipments from his father's company, Thorne Biotech, he was participating in a conflict of interest that harmed the firm. I explained that while the business judgment rule typically protects corporate officers from personal liability for business decisions, it offers no protection for bad faith actions, illegal conduct, or willful blindness. If patients were injured, the corporate veil would not shield him. He would face personal civil lawsuits and potential criminal charges, while Douglas remained clean because Zachary's signature was on the release forms. He was being used as a shield. Zachary went completely pale. The reality of his situation set in, and he realized his father and Douglas had used his ambition to shield themselves. He asked me what he should do, promising to help in any way possible. I told him I needed proof that Douglas had ordered the bypass of our quality assurance protocols. Zachary hesitated for a moment, then opened his archives. He forwarded me a series of direct emails in which Douglas explicitly ordered him to override the Seattle warehouse testing results and sign the release form for the Thorne Biotech shipment. He also shared documents showing that Douglas had promised him a promised performance bonus linked to the Thorne contracts. With Zachary's emails combined with my technical reports, we had an airtight case of self-dealing and deliberate safety violations. I spent the rest of the day working with Sarah to finalize the package. We made sure every PDF, photograph, and spreadsheet was organized and clearly labeled so that the evidence could not be misconstrued or ignored by the legal teams. Sarah had a close connection with Rachel Shaw, a veteran investigative reporter at the Pacific Herald. We agreed that a public disclosure was the only way to prevent Douglas from burying the truth. At the same time, I filed a formal whistleblower complaint with the Federal Medical Device Ethics Board, attaching the safety reports, chemical analyses, and the self-dealing emails. I wanted both a public and a regulatory front so that the board of directors could not quietly sweep this under the rug. By Wednesday morning, the storm broke. Douglas summoned me to his office and slammed a stack of papers on his desk. The ethics board had already initiated an emergency inquiry and contacted our board of directors. Douglas was shaking with rage, asking how I could betray the company after 7 years of support. I looked at him, feeling no fear, only a deep sense of clarity. I told him that I had not betrayed the company. I had protected it from a massive class action lawsuit and saved lives. I told him that he had lost the right to speak about loyalty when he decided to turn surgical safety into a private business deal for his friends. Douglas lowered his voice, telling me that I was finished in the medical device industry and that my career was officially over. I told him that I was comfortable with that outcome as long as I could look at myself in the mirror. I walked back to my desk, opened my computer, and wrote my resignation letter. In the statement of reasons, I wrote that I could no longer work in an environment where professional ethics were treated as optional in the pursuit of personal profit. I hit the send button at exactly 11:11 in the morning. I packed my personal items into a small cardboard box. Sarah came to my desk, giving me a quiet embrace, and promised that she would keep fighting from the inside. Before I walked out of the building, I pinned a final memo to the department bulletin board, informing the team that all updated operations guidelines and transition templates were saved in the shared directory. I walked out into the cool Seattle rain, feeling a strange but profound sense of freedom. I had lost my job, but I had reclaimed my integrity. I was finally ready to start a new chapter. I spent the next few days enjoying the quiet comfort of my home. I kept my work phone switched off and stayed away from social media, focusing on spending quality time with my son, Tyler. We cooked dinners together, watched baseball games, and talked about his upcoming college courses. Seeing the pride in his eyes made me realize that the choice I made was worth every risk. He told me that he was proud to share my name, and that was the greatest reward I could ever receive. A week later, the story broke on the front page of the Pacific Herald. The headline was bold and clear: Defective Surgical Implants. Corruption Scandal Rocks Apex Technologies. Rachel Shaw's investigative piece left no stone unturned. It detailed the substandard titanium shipments, the ignored hospital complaints, and the self-dealing contracts between Douglas and Nicholas Thorne. The public outrage was immediate and intense. Within 24 hours, the board of directors at Apex convened an emergency session to address the crisis. The legal consequences followed swiftly. Under corporate law, because Douglas had engaged in self-dealing and acted in bad faith, the board declared the contracts with Thorne Biotech void ab initio due to fraud and illegality. They launched a massive civil lawsuit against Douglas for breach of fiduciary duty, seeking to recover the millions of dollars lost during the transaction. Because his actions constituted willful misconduct and a breach of the duty of loyalty, the court allowed the board to pierce the corporate veil, targeting Douglas's personal real estate and investment accounts. He was stripped of his position, his reputation was ruined, and his personal wealth was virtually wiped out by the litigation. Nicholas Thorne's company faced federal audits, which led to a mandatory recall of their entire inventory and eventual bankruptcy. Zachary resigned and cooperated fully with the investigators, which spared him from criminal charges, though his corporate career was effectively finished. In the midst of the fallout, I received an email from Eleanor Cole, the chief executive officer of Valiant Biomed. She wrote that she had followed the Apex scandal and was looking for a director of quality assurance who possessed both operational expertise and absolute integrity. We met the following afternoon at her office near Lake Union. The building was bright and open, designed to encourage collaboration rather than secrecy. Eleanor did not offer me a scripted speech. She simply stated that Valiant Biomed built its business on trust and needed someone with the strength to enforce safety standards without compromise. I accepted the position, eager to work in an environment where safety was not viewed as an obstacle to profit. A year later, I returned to downtown Seattle to attend the National Medical Device Conference. As I walked through the convention center lobby, a voice called out my name. I turned to see Zachary. He had changed significantly, wearing a simple shirt and carrying himself with a quiet humility. He told me that he was currently working for a small, medical supply recycling firm in Phoenix. He admitted that the collapse of Apex had been painful, but it forced him to study business ethics and supply chain compliance. He thanked me for explaining the legal risks to him that morning in his office, acknowledging that if he had signed that final release form without pointing to Douglas's pressure, he would likely be sitting in a federal prison. I looked at him and said that what mattered was learning from our mistakes and moving forward with honesty. He smiled, shook my hand, and wished me well before disappearing into the crowd. As I left the conference hall, my phone buzzed with a text message from Rachel Shaw. She informed me that the official Safety Commission report had just been finalized. Thanks to the evidence we provided, more than 1,200 defective orthopedic implants had been successfully recalled from hospitals nationwide, preventing thousands of patients from suffering post-operative complications. I stood on the sidewalk, looking out over the water as a gentle rain began to fall. I did not feel a sudden rush of triumph, but rather a deep, lasting peace. I had spent 7 years of my life dedicated to the wrong people, but in the end, I had found the courage to stand up and reclaim my own path. I stepped into the rain, knowing that I was finally whole again. If you have stayed with me until the end of this journey, I want to ask you a question. Which moment in this story resonated with you the most? Was it when Robert refused to back down to his boss? When he explained the legal reality of fiduciary duty to Zachary? Or when he walked away from the company to protect patient lives? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one of them, because sometimes your shared stories provide the strength that someone else needs to do the right thing. If you believe that honesty and safety should always come before corporate greed, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our next story of quiet courage. Thank you for listening, and remember to always stand up for what is right, no matter the cost. My name is Robert, and this is how I chose integrity over compromise.